Hello everyone, my name is Bálint Károly. I'm a PhD student in history at the Eszterházy Károly Catholic University in Eger and a current Hungarian Research Fellow at the Weird Institute at the University of Alberta. First, I want to thank to the Weird Institute the opportunity to present my research for you in the Central European Talks. Today I will talk about Stefan Zichy, the Chamber President of Hungary, and the patronage of a small group of clerks. The main question is, they were hiding patrons or nobles without patronage. Before I talk about patronage, I must give a brief overview about the historical background of Hungary. 1526 August 29 is one of the most significant dates in Hungarian history. At Mohács, the Hungarian army was defeated by the Ottomans. After the death of King Louis II, the Hungarian nobility had the right to elect a new king because Hungary was an elective kingdom. So, after the Battle of Mohács, the Hungarian nobility elected two kings. In 1526, the majority elected John Zápolya, a wealthy aristocrat who was the voivode of Transylvania, and a little bit later, in 1527, a small minority elected Habsburg Ferdinand. This was because the Hungarian nobility was politically divided. The so-called nationalist group always wanted a king from Hungary, a true indigenous Hungarian king. So they supported one of the greatest lords, John Zápolya. But there was another group who recognizes the rights of Ferdinand. After 1526, Hungary had two elected kings, Ferdinand I and John Zápolya. Over the years, the overall situation did not change. The western and northern part of the Kingdom of Hungary was under the rule of Ferdinand I, and Transylvania was under the rule of John Zápolya, and later his son John Sigismund. So the country became increasingly separated. Both kings had to face with a civil war. Besides that, the Habsburgs had to face with the Ottoman expansion. The reason of this conflict was that Hungary lost a huge part of its territories. But beside that, the kingdom was still huge and a rich country, which was very important for the Habsburg kings. On this map, you can see the result of the Ottoman expansion and the civil war. The middle of the country was under the Ottoman rule. The eastern part became an Ottoman vassal state, the Principality of Transylvania, and the green territory remained under the control of the Habsburgs. What was the Hungarian Chamber and why is it so important for us? In the early ages of his reign, Ferdinand reformed the financial system. This means that the old treasury was transformed into a modern chamber system. The importance of this system was that in all lands of the Habsburgs organized new financial offices. The head of the chamber was the president or prefect. Each of them had a group of councillors, a secretary, an auditor, and a treasurer. The chamber operates almost like a modern office. The clerks had their own offices. They had their own buildings. The clerks were paid by the emperor king monthly. They had working time and weekends and even holidays. The chamber was primarily a financial office. Their main duty were the taxation and the management of the royal possessions around the country. But beside this, they had some other duty. Their other duty was the detection of conspiracies and sometimes the detection of the enemies, mostly Transylvanian and Ottomans. For this, they used spies. They had diplomatically tasks also. They were the members of diplomatically missions, and of course, they had to support the armies during the wars. In local level, the provincial clerks of the chamber were the representatives of the Habsburg emperors and kings. During the 16th century in Hungary, the chamber had bishop presidents. It is different from the other parts of the Habsburg monarchy because in Austria and in Bohemia, the high aristocracy owned the president position because of Because of this, we could find only a few ecclesiastic presidents. In Hungary, this situation had two main reasons. The first was the Reformation. In the 16th century, the majority of the nobility was Protestant. The financials were important for the Habsburgs because during the 16th and 17th century, the incomes of the Habsburg Monarchy were low, and because of the high costs of the Habsburgs need loans from banking families like the Fuggers. They could reduce these loans if the taxation were in order, so they needed reliable and qualified people at the top of this institute. The Roman Catholic Church could produce these people. Another thing that pros the bishop presidents is that they had their own payment, so the king did not have to pay so much for them as a president. The long Turkish War between 1591 and 1604 and the following uprising of István Bocskai, the Protestant prince of Transylvania, between 1604 and 1606 changed many things. In the Treaty of Vienna, the rebels claimed the restoration of the old treasury. After a short crisis, only the head of the chamber changed to a secular president. First, I need to clear what I mean by patronage. Patronage had many definitions. Briefly, under patronage, we usually mean the support of something or somebody. Based on this, I cannot undertake to examine the entire patronage activity, not least because of the scope. Therefore, I only review four major groups. The first one is the education and recommending talented people to influential people to offices or other positions. The second is the supporting of churches and church institutions. The third is the supporting of individuals, especially artists and architects. And last but not least, the fourth one is the publishing various books and publications, patronage of its preparation. After I define the limit of patronage, it must be clarified in which social group Stefan Zichy, the other presidents, and the clerks of the chamber belonged. It is relatively easy. Although István Verbőci explained in his famous work, the Tripartitum Regni Hungariae, that all Hungarian nobles are equal, but that's not the truth. The nobility already had many parts and levels. First, however, I need to give a brief overview of who were the best-known patrons, as well as the fundamental differences between Stefan Zichy, the other prefects of the Hungarian Chamber, and the other nobles of the Hungarian kingdom. Finally, it is important to determine which branches of patronage in the context of the present work will be the ones we will cover in our work. Over the years, several research has focused to the 16th and 17th century patronage of the Hungarian, Transylvanian, and Habsburg monarchies nobility. Serious results were achieved in the case of such significant families in Western Hungary as the Eszterházys, the Nádasdys, and the Batthyánys. Besides them, generous patrons are also known, such as the Rákóczi, the Mágóczi family, and István Tököli, one of the last Lutheran lords. If we are leaving the circle of the aristocracy, we also find families among the landowner lesser nobility who were supporting young talents during their studies and travels abroad or advocating for domestic educational institutions or artists. It is enough to mention István Vityédy, who was one of the most significant Lutheran patrons of the 17th century. Although members of almost all levels of the society also took part in the patronage to a greater or lesser extent, the most important aspect of my work is the patronage of the aristocracy. But I should not focus on the highest circle of the narrow aristocracy, which numbered only a dozen families. The chamber presidents in in the first two-thirds of the 17th century came from the second and third lines of the aristocracy. This group includes those families who after becoming the part of the aristocracy, created to baron or count by the King of Hungary, were not or only with a prominent figure taking part in national politics. Members of this group had limited financial means, most likely not or less sacrificing their wealth to support others. So, based on the outlined points, the first topic of patronage is when a wealthy patron financing the education and upbringing of talented young people and the support recommending of persons from the clients of the family. Unfortunately, only a few information can be found in Stefan Zichy's correspondence on this. For the time being, I and other researchers do not know any talented young people from the circle around Zichy who he would have supported during his chamber presidency or in later periods of his life. Besides the straight patronage, another, perhaps more cost-effective form of supporting young talents is to employ them as fellow students or preceptors beside the school-age children of a noble family. Sad to say, we have no information about the teachers who worked alongside the children of Stefan Zichy. On the other hand, thanks to more recent researches, we know his correspondence with his daughter-in-law, which provides interesting additions about the education of his grandchildren. We know that the elderly Stefan Zichy selected preceptors for his grandchildren. Sad to say, we not know the names and the later careers of these talented people. Examining Stefan Zichy's correspondence better, so far only one letter is known in which he specifically deals with the recommendation of a person. Johann Baptist Podesta, the famous Orientalist, was this man. The chamber president was recommending him to his friend Johann Freyer von Rottal, the privy councillor of the court in Vienna. Podesta already had good reputation. He had Italian descent and studied in Rome. After he left the school, he visited the Ottoman Empire and he even reached the Holy Land. From 1669, he served at the Vienna Military Council, the Hofkriegsrat, as an interpreter. Although the support of relatives such as his son-in-law for his efforts to obtain for a position or the intervention in the selection of the new abbots of San Martin cannot be considered patronizing, but rather an imprint of his personal political goals. One of Zichy's best-known patronage is in contact with a thesis paper which was published in 1665. On the front page of Péter Potormány's thesis paper, an engraving shows the chamber president among the councillors of the Hungarian Chamber with several allegorical depictions. You can see this picture on the previous slide. Unfortunately, to the best of our knowledge, we know only barely 2 dozen thesis papers from this age. Based on these, among the chosen patrons, the authors clearly preferred the current rulers of the kingdom. However, there are quite a few of them which chose one of the influential Hungarian lords as their patrons. On the other hand, we do not know any of those works on which Stefan Zichy's predecessors were eternized. Nevertheless, it cannot be ruled out that the former chamber presidents of the 17th century were not among the supporters. This can also be assumed because, looking at the list, in 1689, Michael Frank appointed Christoph Erdődy, the current president of the Hungarian Chamber, as patron. It seems that for their later career, both made a good decision by their choice. Potormany and Frank also became the officials of the chamber in Bratislava, although Frank was not without precedent. Besides this, the chamber as an institute had the opportunity to support young but poor nobles and by their studies. During the 16th century, the king gave a relative huge amount of money for the chamber. The institute could use it for a patronage of young people. This opportunity was open for mostly lesser nobles, which is understandable because the aristocrats did not need it. These people could apply for once for this aid. They usually used it for the paying of their rent in abroad or for the final examination at the university, which was expensive for a Hungarian lesser noble. Later, in the 17th century, this opportunity still exists. Supporting institutions such as major schools of the age had a key role for the nobility. This is well illustrated by the efforts of the Lutheran estates to establish the College of Prešov. But the support of the Reformed School of Sepsi and later the Reformed College of Sárospatak played a similar role in the eyes of the Reformed estates. The primary representation for the Catholic orders was the University of Trnava, founded by Peter Pazmány, and the various Jesuit grammar schools in parallel. The contacts of Chamber President Zichy with the University of Trnava are little known. None of his sons studied there, but some of his grandsons visited the university at the end of the 17th century. Even though we do not know that he patronized the institute. Although it is not clear from his letters, he was probably one of the most important patrons of the grammar school of the Jesuits in Győr. The reason for this is that he and his family had a very intimate relationship with the town and the Jesuits whom serviced there. Stefan Zichy completed his secondary education in Győr, and he was also a member of the local congregation of Virgin Mary. His sons and grandsons also became students at the grammar school in Győr. Besides the school in Győr, the Church of the Jesuits had an important role which was built up through serious struggles and financed by the local and Western Hungarian Catholic community. Unfortunately, we do not find Stefan Zichy among the supporters. On the other hand, another chamber president, Kaspar Lippai, contributed significant money to the constructions of the building. This was partly due to the fact that Lippai's older brother, John Lippai, a Jesuit monk, was the rector of the institute at the time. Apart from Kaspar Lippai, we know only in the case of Kaspar Horváth de Vegla that even before the founding of the University of Trnava, he donated a garden to the school operating in the town. Furthermore, Kaspar Horváth de Vegla played a major role in supporting the Jesuits both in the Kingdom of Hungary and in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In 1604, he took the Church of Tepla in Lower Hungary from the Lutheran community and gave to the Jesuits. In 1609, he founded a church near the town of Bren in Poland, in the Starostro under his control. Sad to say, we do not know any similar foundation or support from the other chamber presidents or the clerks of the chamber. In the 16th century, one of the greatest problems of the Habsburgs was the Reformation. Not just in the Holy Roman Empire, but in the Bohemian Crown and in Hungary. In the middle of the century, the 80% of the population was the follower of the Protestant churches. Most of them were the followers of the Lutheran and the Calvinist church, but there were some other religious minorities like the Sabbatarians and the Unitarians, mostly in Transylvania, and the Hutterites in the western part of the kingdom. In this case, the Habsburgs had to deal with them. Some of the Habsburgs tried to interrupt the Protestant estates. They give them positions and titles. In the most important secular positions, we usually find Protestant aristocrats. This means that if it was necessary the Habsburgs could work with them. According to my latest research, I found a small group at the chamber who were educated in Wittenberg. The majority of this group was the student of Martin Luther and Philip Melanchthon. In fact, some of them lived in the house of Melanchthon. After they get back to Hungary, some of them became a supporter of the involving Protestant churches. They recommending talents to the Wittenberg University and support of founding schools. Besides this, some of them had personal or corresponding contacts with the main characters of the Reformation not just in Hungary but in Europe. An interesting story that Francis Kopácsi was the son of an early Hungarian reformer and he also became a preacher, but he later became a diplomat. If we turn to another form of patronage, like the support of publishing a book or possibly writing one's own book, we may get mixed results. In the case of the presidents, directors, and other clerks, we know only a couple of libraries or book lists which show us the reading preferences of these people. Besides the libraries, correspondence and diaries could help us in this case. Sad to say, in the analyzed correspondence and diaries, there were no information about commanding on printing. The shopping bills of books also good resources. During my research, I found some of them in which the chamber president Zicci was paying for some Italian newspapers. In his correspondence, I also find some reasons that his son, Stefan Jr., bought some maps and books in The Hague on his grand tour. And once, another nobleman sent to Stefan Zicci a book of Hugo Grotius, which is important for us. The last opportunity to reconstruct the libraries and the reading preferences is the dedication of the books. According to the latest results, only a few books were dedicated to the chamber presidents and the clerks of the chamber during the 16th and 17th century. But from these results, we could get some information. The presidents and the clerks were interested in books mostly, which are in the following three categories. The first is the religious books. Besides the Bible, the majority of them was polemist books, mostly from Hungary and Germany. On the second stage stands the group of history books, mostly in contact with Hungarian, Ottoman, German, French, and Italian history. And on the final stage stands the group of judicial literature, mostly from Hungary and from Germany. These two books are good examples for dedication. The first one is dedicated to Anna Kapi, who was the consort of Chamber President Ladislaus Pete. The book's author was Peter Pázmány, the later Archbishop of Esztergom. The second was dedicated to George and Kaspar Lippai. At this part of the research, I am sad to say, but there are no books which were written by the heads of the chamber. It seems the secular presidents had no time for this kind of passion. In the background, I think maybe stands that they were mostly soldiers before their presidency. Actually, I know that Stefan Zicci wrote some kind of thesis at the end of his studies at the University of Vienna, but I do not know anything about this work. Besides this, I can say that during the 16th and 17th century, the clerks of the chamber were different. I found some talented officials who wrote or translated books. During the 16th century, in the late Renaissance period, some of the people who worked at the chamber had humanist education and they lived and worked like humanists. They wrote humanist books. As I mentioned, there were a humanist group in the 16th century among the clerks who educated in Wittenberg. These people had some excellent works. One of them was Martin Rakowski, probably he had Polish or Slovakian origins, who wrote about the political duties of magistrates. His style and topics were the hardest ones in this period. But there were others, like Albert Peregi, who was the provost of Pécs. He was a lazy humanist because there are only a few humanist letters which is known from him. Probably he had a huge library, but at the moment I only know a short list of his books, which was found in the treasury of the Eszterházy family. These are mostly the works of Erasmus of Rotterdam, but there is a book from Martin Luther and from Melanchthon. During the 17th century, in the Baroque age, the number of the composer clerks was reduced. In the early 17th century lived Johannes Kitonic. He had Croatian origins, who wrote a book about the Tripartitum, which was the most important collection of laws in Hungary during the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. His commentaries were well known, however, his work was translated to Hungarian at the end of the century. It was a really popular work. Lots of libraries had at least one piece of his work. Another clerk was Kaspar Tashi, who translated books. With his works, he was the supporter of the Counter Reformation. His translations were mostly the works of Italian Jesuits. Last year, I published one of his letters in which he recommended two of his works to Hungarian aristocrats in the middle of the 1640s. He mentioned that his books are good spiritual works and good help for the reader. In addition to patronizing talented young people, it is worth mentioning the support and embrace of people who are already active as an artist. Unfortunately, we do not know from the correspondence of Stefan Zichy any famous artists, poets, and painters of the era whom he supported at any stage of his life. Nevertheless, there are two authentic depictions of Stefan Zichy from the period. The first one was recorded in 1649 by Elias Wiedemann, or one of the master's assistants. Appearing in a series marked by the name of Elias Wiedemann, reveals that Zichy was already a significant person in 1649 as a vice general of the Győr border region, and he was also aware of the importance of patronizing arts. In the other work, an unknown artist painted a portrait of the chamber president on canvas in the 1660s. In addition, we do not have any other information from the 17th century that Stefan Zichy carried out of arts patronage. He was not alone with this. From his office predecessors, only Kaspar Lippai, Mihail Maitényi, and Paul Palfi portraits are known, also from the Wiedemann series. From the 16th century, we know only the portrait of Johannes Dezsőfi, the only secular president of the era. Besides this, we have some information that these people supported musicians. Sad to say, we do not know their names. For example, in 1654, Stefan Zichy asked a Hungarian lord, Adam Batyányi, to send to him his Turkish musician because he really liked this type of music and he want to listen his play. At the moment, this is my only information about musicians about this group. There is no information about employing sculptors among this social group. The presidents were new aristocrats, except Paul Palfi, who stood out significantly from this line. In his case, we know that he certainly supported artists, including architects, who rebuilt and redesigned his castles in Vöröskő and Etrekő in Baroque style. This can be similar assumed in the case of the Erdődy family, whose members served as presidents of the Hungarian Chamber from the last third of the 17th century to the first half of the 18th century. True that proof of these patronage are only known from the 18th century. We can be sure that the other presidents did not carry out constructions of a similar size, even if they get huge estates like divine or Sassin. In the correspondence, I cannot find any sign of employing artists or major craftsmen. Probably there were financial limits in the background for the other presidents of the chamber, with the exemption of the members of the two families mentioned, we can come to similar conclusion. A good example, even if Stefan Zichy built his maison in Rusovce, which served as his home, according to the artistic trends and style of the time, not much could be survived of it. From the earlier research, we know that Stefan Zichy carried out constructions on several mansions and castles on his possessions, such as in Strasbourg and in Jánosháza. Due to subsequent reconstructions during the 18th and 19th century, there are only a few or no sign of these remained to these days. In the case of the clerks of the chamber, we had little information. However, they were nobles. They mostly lived in the towns of the kingdom. Interesting that we know a little about their houses and castles. In the beginning of the 17th century, Nicolaus Perekedi, who was the councillor of the chamber, built up a new mason near Bratislava in the town of Strust. We know from his correspondence what kind of materials did he use to his home and what kind of masters did he employ. From the end of the 17th century, thanks to a document, we know the house of Sigismund Holló in Košice. From the document, we could reconstruct his material culture. Maybe the further research could produce more. The aristocrats, including the presidents of the chamber who were at home in cities like Vienna, had a better chance of employing artists and other creators and competing with each other. On the other hand, in only 2.5 cases can be sure when the presidents of the Hungarian Chamber had some real estates in the capital city. Paul Palfi and his family already had good relations in Vienna in the 16th century, while at the turn of the 16th and 17th century, Ladislaus Pete probably had a house in the imperial city. In the case of Stefan Zichy, we know from a letter that he had a small house in the city, but it was least suitable for representation as it was burned down in 1654. It looks a huge difference, but if we think on the members of the Hungarian aristocracy, who generally were away from Vienna, and only a few of them had their own estates in the city, it is normal. The outcome of this was that most of the aristocrats was out of the opportunities to get in contact with the artists and other creators. At the end of my presentation, I want to thank you very much for listening. If you have any question, feel free to email us at weirdinstitute@unialberta.ca. Thank you for listening again.